Okay. Who's next?
Well, next I was going to go over our review of this and what
Okay,
our initial
you're
perspective.
talking about the Independent Science
Yeah.
Board
No,
and
I'm
the
talking about
science
DSC
plan?
staff.
Okay, good.
So in looking at this, this would represent an overall improvement in the current conditions in terms of flow and in terms of the ecosystem potentially. It would increase the flows in a way that would more closely match the natural flow regime. I think it's important to note that this 35% is a narrative objective.
Mark,
Yes, sir.
just a minute. How can you say that it will dramatically improve the conditions when all we know for sure is it's going to increase the water flowing in the river? And as I pointed out, we already have that level of flow in the Stanislaus. And I think if you look at the record, the salmon fishery over the last 10 years hasn't done any better in the Stanislaus than it's done in the Tuolumne and the Merced. So I think what you just said is inaccurate.
And it may be in terms of what the science shows. What my point is that this 35% does represent an increase, and then the intent to match the natural flow regime is a change from kind of the ongoing flows and the base flows, and even what were probably fairly short-term flows during the VAMP period. So this is an intent to, over a longer period of time, more closely match the natural flow regime, not just the volume. It's not just about the volume, it's about the functions, and we'll talk about that in a second too. So I think that's what we feel like would represent an improvement over the current conditions. In addition, the current conditions suggest for a lot of this that the flows are probably less than that 35%, apart from what that regime looks like and the timing on it, that the actual flows historically have been less. So that's where we feel like looking at this, it's really that pattern that represents the improvement, not so much necessarily just the flows. It's also important to note this 35% is a narrative standard, and that's why there is this kind of variance. And if you look at this Appendix K that's in there, there is this discussion of between 25 and 45%, and that a COG would meet and have an annual adaptive management plan that would get together. In addition, this is 35% above, 35% relative to those three tribs. So it's in addition to any other inflow from the rest of the San Joaquin above the Merced, from any tribs that are in between. Now that's not a huge amount, but it's an appreciable amount. So this is 35% in addition to any of those background flows that would be there. So it's also important to note that this will not meet the 60% flow criteria that was mentioned as far as the ecosystem needs. It will not meet all the agricultural needs. This does represent something of a compromise, and we recognize that this is hitting somewhere in the middle, and noting that it's not going to hit all those objectives. I think part of our concern relates to how they would do this adaptive management plan, the annual adaptive management plan. What it calls for is a group of agencies and a group of water users to get together and annually come up with this plan, and they would have to reach agreement for this plan to then go to the executive director of the water board. In addition, the executive director of the water board would decide who else should be on this group beyond just the agencies that are named in this proposal. And that's where we're recommending that the Delta lead scientist be involved, and that the executive director work with the Delta lead scientist of the DSC, so that there's that scientific input about who else should be on this group that meets. It's also not entirely clear what happens if they don't reach agreement. Certainly the implication is that 35% standard would be a hard standard, and that might be the incentive. But it's conceivable that these disparate groups would have a hard time reaching agreement on this plan each year. And so I think as staff we have some concerns about what does that look like if they don't. And then it just falls to the executive director to try to decide, okay, well, then what are we going to do? What's this 35% going to look like? It's one thing to have 35%. It's another thing to say, how are you going to implement that? So I think that's another concern that we have. We suggest that the SED should also have a more thorough assessment on whether reducing these flows will result in greater reliance on water diverted from the delta as a result, either directly or through water exchanges for folks. So we're not clear on what effect this reduced flow would have on the delta as a whole. That's not outlined in this, and we think not looked at.
See that you said reduced flow.
I'm sorry.
I don't
The
understand.
35% standard, we're not sure what effect the flows are going to have on reduced supplies to folks. That when they try to negotiate compensating for that, what's that going to look like and how's that going to affect delta flows? So we'd like a little bit more analysis on that. Does that make sense?
Well, the reduced supply would directly impact Merced, Turlock, Modesto, Oakdale, South San Joaquin irrigation districts. Is that the reduced
Yeah.
supply you're talking about?
Correct.
Okay.
Sorry if I wasn't clear.
So it's clear it's either a fallowing of acreage, and you cite 82,000 acres, or it's going to require more groundwater pumping, which in either case is kind of problematic.
Correct. Or how that's going to be implemented among the people involved. We also support a proposal for a long-term adaptive management approach, but with both that and the annual adaptive management plan, it's not clearly expressed in here that the data and information that's relied on by these groups be made available to the public. And that's our recommendation, is that this be a public process. We presume that would be the case, but it's not explicitly provided for. And so that's another of our staff recommendations, is that that information would be made available to the public. And then finally, in addition to consideration of an approach that uses a percentage of unimpaired flow, we suggest that the State Water Board incorporate the natural functional flows as they're described in the draft Delta Plan. That is different from just the strict percentage of unimpaired flow. Natural functional flows also looks at what those flows functionally did, whether it's interconnected habitat areas, looking at the peaks of the flow and what kind of functions those peaks provided. So we're concerned that just a percent of unimpaired flow doesn't go as far as we would like to see it go, and doesn't go as far as we've discussed in the draft Delta Plan relative to natural functional flows, not just natural flows. Are there any questions? Any other feedback of what you'd like
Do
us
you
to
believe
be
that this process is reflecting the notion that somehow we might not be able to give all people, all business, all industry, all environment, all the water they want all the time, forever and for all times in the future?
I do, but that's a big question.
Yeah, right.
And there's much more to that.
No, let me pass on that. Is Dr. Lund next?
Yeah, Dr. Lund would be next.
Okay, Dr. Witt. I'm sorry.
I just
excuse
have
me.
one question for Les. What impact will the upcoming FERC license agreements on the Merced and the Tuolumne have on this flow regime?
That's a good question. Sorry, I didn't speak to the Phase 3, which is the implementation of our flow objectives. We recognize we have now those ongoing proceedings for the Merced and the Tuolumne. This is the general water quality control planning, so the general flow prescription, if you will. We think that it's good regulation, and we've certainly have heard it from the affected parties, that it's like, so you're going to be regulating us with this number, and then you're going to come back with the FERC doing this. And so we have water quality certification authority under the FERC relicensing. So what we're proposing to do at this point, we think that this determination is sufficiently encompassing in terms of what the general flow prescription, the general quantity of water needs to be for that February through June period for the outmigration. More details, more tributary-specific information we think is going to fall out of the studies that are being developed as part of the FERC processes. That might very well provide some of the specificity as to, well, you need to do this in terms of ramping or have a flow pulse, things like that. So we have the general prescription, and the FERC processes will identify some of the details. Similarly, we're not looking at periods outside of that February through June period. Those FERC processes will. though we don't generally have problems with too little flow at the rest of those times, but there's potentially temperature issues, tributary temperature-specific issues. So all of that will be falling out of those FERC processes. And then we're intending to implement the water quality control plan through our water quality certifications on the Merced and the Tuolumne, and as necessary through water rights proceedings to do any other pieces that are not encompassed by those FERC proceedings, as if that makes sense. Okay.
Dr. Lund.
Thank you. The Science Board has taken a little bit of a look at the SED. We had two members that looked at it in more depth. We were fortunate in having some guidance as to which parts, since we didn't read all 2,000 pages, I apologize for that. But we were pointed usefully in the direction of looking particularly at Appendix K. We discussed this a little bit at our February 14th and 15th Independent Science Board meeting. We had some staff from the State Water Resources Control Board there to discuss this with us. Overall, the Science Board was impressed with the broad thinking and the flexibility embodied in this work, with this plan, and the realization that there are many entities that are involved in managing the system and the objectives of the water quality control plan. So I think that's really important. One of the things, at least is my own personal observation here now, is that we have a lot of planning going on with different entities, and in the end, they have to come together. They have to work together. And so personally, I appreciated seeing at least one of the plans reflecting that they were going to have to fit in with a whole bunch of other things and have some flexibility left in their plan to do that. There were some concerns that the recommended flows might not be enough to restore salmon, and that it might not be just the flows, that it might be the geomorphological aspects of the flows and not just the flows themselves. There is some concern that the 14-day averaging might make the flows less natural, but it seemed like not a bad place to start in a sense. The idea that there should be monitoring plans and performance measures specified sometime in the future came up, as well as more detailed water quality and biological analysis to help over time that there be some adaptive management. So how do you design essentially the physical and biological, and perhaps also chemical water quality monitoring, so that over time you can learn from the experiences here, much as you've pointed out, Mr. Fiorini, on what can we make of all this after it's been going on. If we're going to call this adaptive management and actually be adaptive management, we have to figure out a way that we can learn from our experiences, because there's considerable uncertainties in the ultimate biological population impacts of most of these decisions. We have a comment. We're refining a memo, beginning a short memo on this that'll be produced by the Science Board.
And our file contains your 2012 letter to Mr. Grover.
Yes, that was before my time, so I...
Yes. But you wouldn't watch.
Yes.
You watched all that going on.
From some distance.
Yeah. All right. Carl?
So mostly we wanted to make sure that you understood the process, that we are developing comments. Comments are due March 29th. That's a ways off. So we're going to be refining these comments based on what we've heard here. And based on looking at it more, there are a lot of parts to this, and I think we want to dig into some more of the concerns and the areas where we have some questions. And then we'll be working with our science folks, not the Independent Science Board directly, but with our internal science folks, to make sure that we address some of the science questions that we have relative to this proposal as well.
Pursuant to the council discussion earlier on the science plan and all of this, we have a slightly more specified adaptive management scheme. I wouldn't argue it's a fully developed scheme, but it's slightly more developed than the BDCP initial stuff. And it just would be helpful for you to reflect on these. You've already made the observation. It calls for consensus, and if there is no consensus, it's not altogether clear what happens. That's an issue. But Also, the Water Board is setting up a system and a body of people that will participate in developing an adaptive management framework and judgments and all that. And there may be some interesting questions that are worth raising with regard to this effort that would educate us a little bit about what, if anything, we would wish to say to BDCP, or the Science Board might wish to say to BDCP if we make comments to them in the future. I mean, it just seems to me that as more and more planning efforts are required to include adaptive management, we are inching forward on a discussion of what it means, and we're getting slightly different views about how to do it. And nothing's quite right yet, but the discussion is very interesting. So push Les a little bit on that so he can tell you the definitive things that are yet to come. Yeah, Randy.
Mark, in terms of the staff response to this, Les asked a question that deserves an answer, and that is, how do we add rigor to the 10 or 12 other actions that could be taken to improve the conditions for salmon? Stream bed restoration, reducing predators, hatchery. And I think it's a question worthy of the science program's response to add value to this discussion about flows and how we get to things that are almost universally recognized as a problem, and yet we may end up with one agency that refuses to do anything about it, i.e. predator reduction. So I think our science program staff could add a lot of value to this process by finding a way to help Les add rigor to all of these other things that may be more important in this reach of the river than a 10% more flow.
We would greatly appreciate that, and I have to punch. It's not less, but our board is very mindful of those other things, so is very interested in getting that information.
Well, maybe it's time to go back and examine the work. Let's see, Cliff Dahm had done it before Dr. Goodwin came on board, and then I think even the ISB did a modified version of stressors, attempting, you and I were kind of complaining, tell us what the stressors are, tell us the most important stressors, long digression. You can't ask us, you can't expect us to give you an answer on what's the most important. We said, well, give us a hint. How about tell us if you had 4 things to do, what 4 things would you want to test first? And maybe this is an occasion for that kind of approach, broad brush, to be sure, but that kind of approach, because the flow standards brings back to the board not only options on standards, but also all the parties that might be nudged toward a cooperative solution comparable to what Les was talking about, with a more broadly expressed series of steps than just simply go up, go down. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that would be helpful. That would be helpful. Okay, anything else? All right. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Mr. Grover, thank you very much for coming over. Okay.